At this point in the fantasy season, a defense absolutely makes or breaks your week, and luckily we've got week-winning defenses every single week in fantasy football. And that's why for years now, I have gone through top 12 defense rankings every single week in fantasy football, and I'm one of the only ones to do it over that time frame. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Get in our first tier right here. We've got the Vikings defense at number 1, and they're at Jacksonville this week. Listen, the Vikings defense is back up to number 1. They're the number 1 defense in fantasy football, and they've already had a bye week as well. So they're outperforming defenses that have already played all 9 games, but the Vikings defense has been that good. They're averaging 11.9 fantasy points per game. Why is that? Well, it's because they're getting the sacks per game needed. They're getting 3.5 sacks per game. They're getting after quarterbacks here. They're getting interceptions and fumble recoveries per game. They're averaging 3 turnovers per game, and Jacksonville is one of the most turnover-prone teams in football today. Trevor Lawrence, over the last 4 games, 4 interceptions from him. He's actually been a disgrace. He's been a disaster, and Minnesota has 17 total turnovers and 13 interceptions. Their defense is a nightmare for any opposing quarterback, for any opposing team. The Vikings are absolutely going to be a week-winning defense this week. At number 2, I feel similar to the Chargers defense. I don't remember a time this year where I've ranked the Chargers outside of the top 12 because they've been consistently great in fantasy football. Now, they always haven't had big weeks like they just did last week. They've always been kind of around, 10, maybe 8 to 7 fantasy points. Last week was an explosion week for them. And I think the same thing could happen again 2 weeks in a row. They're averaging already 3 sacks per game and over 2 turnovers per game through interceptions and fumbles recovered. Obviously, they're taking on the Tennessee Titans at home, which have the second worst turnover differential. Now, obviously, without Will Levis, that one goes down a little bit because they're not as turnover prone with Mason Rudolph. But the bottom line here is that they're going to get after Mason Rudolph because their pass rush is really, really tough. And also, the Titans just aren't putting up many points on a weekly basis here. So I do think that Tennessee is absolutely in massive trouble because the Chargers defense is almost unstoppable at this point. At number 3, the Bears defense taking on the New England Patriots in Chicago this week. Listen, the Bears defense has been really good for the majority of the year. The past 2 weeks, they haven't done particularly well, and I do think the only thing that worries me, and the reason that they're not higher taking on the Patriots, is because I did not like the way that they responded after the blown Hail Mary last week. They did not particularly perform well against the Arizona Cardinals here. So I just ultimately don't think that this team is in a situation where I can trust them going up against the Patriots because the Bears can't score offensively. Neither can the Patriots particularly well. But one thing they can do offensively is with Drake May, they can move the ball more effectively. So unless the Chicago Bears can figure some stuff out, I won't have them at number 1, but obviously, they're taking on the Patriots, who are turnover prone with Drake May, and they don't put up many points, so the Bears have to stay inside of my top 3. Dropping down to our next tier, the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Denver Broncos. The Kansas City Chiefs defense, they've been really good at an NFL level. Now, 2 out of the last 3 weeks, they've actually done really well in fantasy as well. But you could just see on the screen, their per game numbers as far as getting big plays go, that doesn't amount to many fantasy points per game. That's what we need on the defensive side of the ball. We need those turnovers and we need those sacks. They're not getting that many sacks per game, only 2, and they're not getting that many turnovers per game when you combine interceptions and fumble recoveries. That's why they're only averaging 7 fantasy points per game. But of course, they're taking on the Broncos this week, who the Broncos proved last week they're obviously not in that top tier of teams yet in the NFL. And also, Denver is prone to turnovers here. So with Bo Nix in this divisional matchup, I expect the Chiefs to play them really well at home in Kansas City. And I do think the Chiefs ultimately end up being a really good play in fantasy football this week. The Falcons defense at number 5 at the New Orleans Saints this week. Listen, I really, really love this matchup here because the New Orleans Saints are a disaster. This is a tire fire like we haven't seen in a long time. Actually, New Orleans is going back. You remember back in the day when people used to call the New Orleans Saints the Aints? That's what we're going back to in New Orleans. This team is a disaster. They just traded away Marshawn Lattimore while I was filming this video right now, and the Falcons, I do think that their defense is not particularly good in fantasy. Their defense in fantasy football only only averaging 4.5 fantasy points per game. 1 sack per game is not good enough, and the turnovers just aren't amounting to much, but New Orleans is a disaster. They will not have Chris Olave in this game, and it's all coming down to Alvin Kamara, but at the same time, Derek Carr is definitely prone to interceptions as well. So I do think that this is just the way the Saints are operating right now. I cannot see them putting up more than 17 points in this game and not coming out with a couple of turnovers to the Atlanta Falcons here. I've got the Falcons at number 5. And the Eagles defense at number 6 to round out this tier. At Dallas this week, obviously the Eagles defense hit or miss in fantasy over the last month in particular. They've improved in fantasy football, but it's not to what I believe they could be at some point this year. With Vic Fangio, it's been a little disappointing, but like I said, it's improving just a little bit here. They're almost averaging 3 sacks per game, which is the number they should be hitting. They're almost averaging 2 turnovers per game. They're getting closer to that number, and obviously, Dallas is a freaking mess. They have no Dak Prescott this week, likely no CeeDee Lamb. What else do they have? That team's a disaster. That team's a disgrace. That's what the Dallas Cowboys are. I think the Eagles end up hammering the Dallas Cowboys in Dallas this week. I don't care if they play in Dallas or in Timbuktu. This defense is going to eat up the Dallas Cowboys because they suck and the Eagles defense is constantly improving. If you haven't taken advantage of Underdog, this is the week to do it because Lamar Jackson's projection on Underdog on Thursday night is 0.5 total yards. This is free money attached to it when you hit the higher on this one. And if you haven't taken advantage yet, go down in the comments, grab the link that's there, and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog. They'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you take advantage of this sweat-free projection and hit the higher on this Lamar Jackson projection this week. Dropping down to our next tier, the 49ers defense at number 7 at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Listen, hat tip to Baker Mayfield. That guy has done so well this year, and every step of the way, people doubt him, including myself, and he outperforms expectations. They could have easily beat the Chiefs on Monday night. Obviously, it doesn't come through. He's still lacking weapons and lacking a defense, but that's a different point. The 49ers are coming off a bye week, and their defense is starting to get healthier. They're practicing more. They've got some starters returning, and their defense, either way, has been a monster for a lot of teams in fantasy. They're averaging 2.5 sacks per game, but they're averaging basically 2 turnovers per game between interceptions and fumbles recovered. This defense is really playing physical football. And the one thing about Baker Mayfield, even though he's done really well this year, and I have a lot of respect for his season so far, he still does turn the ball over. He should have actually had a couple interceptions on Monday night. Chiefs players were dropping the ball. So I do think that with this 49ers defense coming out of the bye week, I think that this is an opportunistic matchup for the 49ers to take advantage of. At number 8, the Bills defense at the Indianapolis Colts. Listen, I wanted to put the Bills higher, but they really let me down against the Dolphins here, and I probably shouldn't have had them that highly ranked. I was expecting them to get turnovers, but listen, at the Indianapolis Colts this week, the one thing that really shocked me was that Flacco was not only bad against the Minnesota Vikings, he was turning the ball over. Like, he looked really, really bad. And the Buffalo Bills, you take out last week, they've been pretty solid in fantasy for the most of the month. I mean, they're getting turnovers. They're getting more sacks per game. So this one's a little bit harder to predict, to be honest with you, because I can see a world where Flacco bounces back a little bit and has a better game at home this week versus the Bills. But I also could see a game where they just start to lose some trust in Flacco, and this offense is starting to kind of crack a little bit. So I think that the Bills will be a top 10 play this week. They're just not the safest play that you can find this week in fantasy. And the Cardinals defense at number 9 to round this tier out versus the New York Jets. Listen, I've been saying this for weeks too. The Cardinals defense is low-key really good. They've been really good in fantasy for the majority of the year. 6.9 fantasy points per game doesn't tell the whole story. They've had multiple big games in fantasy football, and they've played some really good opponents. Like, that's the thing. They played really good opponents. Now, obviously, Aaron Rodgers looked really good last week versus the Houston Texans, and he wasn't turning the ball over, and he was hitting all his playmakers in stride for touchdowns here. Listen, that's a great thing to see, and he's obviously coming into this week off of basically mini bye because they played on Thursday night last week. But the Cardinals defense here, I don't expect them to really cede a lot of points to the Jets. I think this is a low-scoring game. Listen, the Cardinals have a defensive head coach running their team, and the New York Jets with Aaron Rodgers, I simply don't trust that he's all of a sudden found this new way where he doesn't turn the ball over. I think we will see more turnovers this week, and I think the Cardinals are a relatively high ceiling play this week. Dropping down to our last tier, the Detroit Lions at number 10 at the Houston Texans. Listen, the Lions would probably not be here if they weren't so dominant over the last month. Their defense is the number one defense over the last month of fantasy football. They have been dominant with or without Aiden Hutchinson. Their team has stepped up completely without Aiden Hutchinson. They are still getting after the quarterback at 2.5 sacks per game, and they're getting 2 turnovers per game, combining interceptions and fumbles recovered. The Detroit Lions are averaging 9.4 fantasy points per game, and they've done it against good offenses. So this Houston Texans matchup doesn't particularly scare me because Stroud is not playing his best and their offensive line is so weak. I believe the Lions get after CJ Stroud again this week on Sunday night. The only thing that keeps the Lions down a little bit lower is that Nico Collins is probably going to return, which definitely gives the Texans their biggest big play option back. That's a big deal for CJ Stroud. So I do think that they will score more in this game, but I also don't think that they're going to be able to protect CJ Stroud enough to keep the Lions outside of the top 10 this week. At number 11, the Broncos defense at Kansas City this week. Listen, I think that the Broncos defense, they've been so good in fantasy football. Obviously, they ran into a buzzsaw last week versus the Baltimore Ravens. They had -3 fantasy points, and that's a tough week, right? Like, you can't expect the Broncos to have a great week defensively. That's why they weren't inside the top 12 last week. This week against Kansas City, the one thing about Kansas City is even though they did play relatively clean football against the Tampa Bay Bucks, Kansas City has turned the ball over. Mahomes has not played the cleanest football throughout the entire season, and the Raiders kind of showed in those divisional matchups. That's sometimes where Mahomes starts to struggle a little bit. The Broncos defense, listen, I expect Pat Surtain to be able to put clamps on DeAndre Hopkins much better than the Bucs did on Monday night. So I do think the Broncos defense ends up being a solid play in the top 12 in fantasy football this week. Not the highest ceiling for sure, but I think their floor this week is relatively stable. And then rounding it all out, the Giants defense at number 12 versus the Carolina Panthers. This is a Germany game. It's on at 8:30 on Sunday, so make sure your lineup is set before that. I think you can do worse than the Giants defense this week. The Giants defense is in a situation where they're going to Germany to take on the Panthers, and the Panthers obviously looked much better offensively versus the New Orleans Saints. Well, the Saints defense has crumbled into bits. The Giants, the one thing about them is a lot of their games, they're keeping low scores. What happens at the end of the game is when the Giants defense has been on the field all day because Daniel Jones can't move the rock, and then they just kind of collapse. Well, this is a good week for it because the Panthers are turnover prone and they don't score many points themselves. I think the Giants end up having a pretty decent game. Again, pretty high floor game with a relatively moderate ceiling. That's why the Giants are at 12 and not higher, because I do think that the Giants defense are a solid play this week. And as I do at the end of every single week, I give you my favorite defense to pick up in advance for next week if you have the roster space to do it. And I never thought this defense I would be really willing to pick up and play, but in week 11, I think the Dolphins defense is a good pickup and play. They're at home versus the Las Vegas Raiders. We all know that the Raiders are a disgrace. They've been an absolute dumpster fire the entire year. It's only getting worse. Not only did they fire their offensive coordinator, who was not a good coach, they fired 2 other guys as well. The Las Vegas Raiders are a wreck right now in football. Listen, they already are turning the ball over and already looking horrible offensively, and the Dolphins defense is not particularly good, but every team, I believe, is going to take advantage of the Raiders at this point. So they're a good pickup and play for week 11. So let me know how your lineup is starting to look this week, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for this week, click on this video right here.